It started with a quiet but firm message from Washington, a warning. The United States has cautioned Canada not to back out of its purchase of the American-made F-35 fighter jets, making it clear that walking away could have consequences. It wasn't just about defense hardware. It was about alliances, influence, and the silent power of obligation. Prime Minister Mark Carney, fresh from announcing a massive boost in military spending, now faces a dilemma that runs deeper than budgets or strategy. Because Canada's own Auditor General has revealed what many inside the defense community already feared: the F-35 program is bleeding money. Costs have ballooned far beyond initial estimates, and whispers inside Ottawa suggest that even senior officials are starting to wonder, is this still worth it? Yet, despite the growing concerns, Ottawa insists it's staying the course, committed to buying 88 F-35s from Lockheed Martin. At least, that's what the official line says. But when Carney ordered a review of the contract last week, it wasn't just bureaucratic housekeeping. It was a signal. Something has shifted. Behind closed doors, Canada is questioning whether it's trapped in a deal it can no longer afford, politically or financially. And while all this unfolds, another name quietly rises from the north: the Gripen E. For years, it was dismissed as an underdog, a lightweight fighter in a sky ruled by billion-dollar giants. But what emerged from Sweden's modest workshops was far from ordinary. It was a jet born from restraint, intelligence, and a fierce sense of independence. The Gripen E challenged the assumption that cutting-edge air power requires endless money. Instead, it proved that innovation can come from clarity of purpose, not just complexity of design. It's not just a machine of defense, it's a symbol of defiance, of how a small nation with limited resources can rewrite the rules of modern air strategy. Sweden didn't just build a fighter, it built a statement, a declaration that technology doesn't belong only to superpowers. And now, Canada, after decades of flying outdated jets, finds itself standing at a crossroads between American dependence and the chance to reclaim a measure of freedom in the skies. Friends, if you enjoy video, make sure to like this video and subscribe to SkyJet Wings for more deep, original defense analysis. For decades, the CF-18s had been the pride of the Royal Canadian Air Force, symbols of precision, reliability, and national strength. But time, as always, caught up. Those once dominant jets had become relics of a different age, an era when dogfights were simpler and the world was less volatile. They had served faithfully, but the skies had changed. The threats of the modern battlefield were no longer predictable. Drones, hypersonic weapons, electronic warfare, the airspace had evolved into something far more complex and unforgiving. Canada needed more than an aircraft. It needed a new identity in defense, something that could stand in this era of invisible wars and instant strikes. At first glance, the answer looked obvious. The United States was marketing its crown jewel, the F-35 Lightning II. A stealth fighter wrapped in futuristic design and backed by the largest military power on Earth. It looked like something pulled straight from a sci-fi film, sleek, fast, and unstoppable. To many, the F-35 wasn't just a jet, it was a status symbol, a sign of belonging to the world's elite defense club. Buying it meant prestige, partnership, and political comfort. But far away from the global spotlight, in the quiet laboratories of Saab in Sweden, a very different idea was taking shape. There were no billion-dollar marketing campaigns, no loud promises of global dominance, just a small group of engineers driven by one belief: a fighter jet doesn't have to be the most expensive to be the most effective. Their creation was built on efficiency, adaptability, and control. Values deeply rooted in Sweden's long-standing tradition of self-reliance. They called it the Gripen. The Gripen wasn't designed to conquer continents. It was designed to protect a nation's skies with intelligence and precision. Sweden, surrounded by uncertainty and historically left to defend itself, learned that survival doesn't always come from power. Sometimes it comes from ingenuity. Every bolt, every circuit, every line of code in the Gripen reflected that philosophy. So when Canada announced its open competition for a new fighter jet, Saab entered quietly. No hype, no grandstanding, just confidence in what they had built. Few believed Sweden could compete with the American giants. But the Gripen had something the others didn't, a purpose shaped by practicality. From the first proposal, it stood out. Where the F-35 required vast infrastructure, special maintenance bays, and layers of American oversight, the Gripen promised something simpler: freedom. It could land on ordinary highways, refuel and rearm in minutes, and remain battle-ready even in the brutal cold of the Canadian Arctic. It didn't demand massive air bases or endless teams of technicians. And perhaps most importantly, it offered full sovereignty. Canada would own every part of the jet: the software, the weapon systems, the data, everything. No foreign permissions, no waiting for updates, no hidden lockouts. For a country stretched from frozen tundra to sprawling coastlines, that independence wasn't just appealing, it was necessary. Because in today's world, control isn't just about firepower. It's about the ability to decide without asking anyone else for permission. The Gripen was never meant to impress with extravagance. It was meant to work. It could take off and land in places where runways didn't even exist, stretches of highway, frozen fields, even improvised strips carved out of wilderness. It was built for nations that couldn't rely on the luxury of foreign bases or allied support. For Canada, a land of rugged terrain and remote borders, the Gripen felt like more than just an aircraft. It felt like a mirror of its identity: independent, adaptable, and quietly capable. For a brief moment, the match seemed perfect. An aircraft designed for self-reliance in a country that has always defined itself by that very principle. But in global politics, perfection rarely lasts. Across the border, in Washington, the mood was shifting. The idea of a NATO ally, especially one as close and strategic as Canada, choosing a Swedish jet over America's flagship fighter was uncomfortable. Not because of capability, but because of symbolism. To the United States, defense deals are not just transactions, they're instruments of influence. So the conversations began. First in friendly tones, then in firmer ones. Meetings turned into briefings, and briefings slowly turned into pressure. American officials began talking about interoperability, shared defense goals, and strategic alignment. Diplomatic phrases that sounded cooperative but carried unmistakable weight. The message between the lines was clear: stay in step with us. What followed were years of gridlock. Delays, debates, and internal divisions gripped Ottawa. Politicians clashed on live television. Defense analysts split into two camps, one insisting on American partnership, the other arguing for independence. Meanwhile, the public watched as the costs ballooned and timelines stretched beyond reason. Eventually, the outcome seemed inevitable. Canada bowed to pressure and confirmed its purchase of the F-35. In Washington, the announcement was met with smiles and celebration. In Ottawa, it brought relief, at least officially. And in Stockholm, only silence. For Saab, it was a loss, but not a defeat. Because while the deal slipped away, the mission didn't. The engineers went back to work, refining, enhancing, perfecting. They believed the world would one day see the Gripen for what it truly was: a fighter built not for status, but for strategy. That moment arrived sooner than anyone expected. During a major NATO training exercise in Europe, the Gripen E, the newest and most advanced variant, took to the skies, side by side with the elite of the world's air forces. The Eurofighter Typhoon, France's Rafale, and America's own F-35. Observers expected the Gripen to fade quietly into the background. Instead, something else happened. Something no one had planned for or was ready to admit. The skies above Europe turned into a proving ground. The competition was fierce, the best of the best locked in simulated combat. The Eurofighter Typhoon, France's Rafale, America's F-35, and Sweden's quiet contender, the Gripen E. Most analysts expected the Gripen to perform well, clean, efficient, but unremarkable. And yet, what unfolded left even the most seasoned military observers in disbelief. In a series of electronic warfare drills, the Gripen E didn't just hold its own, it bent the rules of engagement. Radar operators watched their screens go haywire. Missiles lost lock. Enemy targeting systems went blind. Instead of hiding from radar, the Gripen E played with it, dancing in and out of detection like a ghost. Pilots from other nations later described the experience in one word: haunting. It felt like fighting a phantom, one NATO pilot said, a jet that was everywhere and nowhere at once. The Gripen wasn't the biggest, fastest, or flashiest fighter in the sky. It was smaller, lighter, and a fraction of the cost. But it outmaneuvered and outsmarted everything thrown against it, not through brute force, but through intelligence. One senior NATO officer reportedly described the encounter as facing an opponent that could think. And in many ways, he was right. Where the F-35 relies on stealth to disappear, the Gripen relies on deception to confuse. Its systems manipulate radar signals, create false echoes, and flood enemy sensors with misinformation until the battlefield itself becomes uncertain. It doesn't hide, it rewrites visibility. In a world obsessed with billion-dollar stealth coatings and maintenance-heavy secrecy, Sweden had achieved something extraordinary: affordable invisibility through smart engineering and electronic warfare mastery. When word of the exercise reached Ottawa, it stirred something uncomfortable. Reports from European officers painted a picture that clashed sharply with Canada's current path. The aircraft, once dismissed as too small, too modest, too foreign, had just outperformed the world's most expensive fighter. Defense experts began to ask the question no government wanted to hear. Had Canada made the wrong choice? Had the country traded its autonomy for alliance, its practical defense needs for political prestige? Had it ignored the one aircraft that truly fit its geography, its climate, and its strategic philosophy, in favor of one that looked impressive on paper but demanded constant dependence? The contrast between the two jets was more than technical, it was ideological. One represented freedom through self-sufficiency, the other safety through submission. And as those questions echoed through defense circles, one thing became clear. Canada's decision was no longer just about planes. It was about what kind of nation it wanted to be. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this breakdown insightful, don't forget to like, subscribe, SkyJet Wings. The F-35 Lightning II is often described as a marvel of modern engineering, a flying supercomputer, a symbol of 21st century military power. And in many ways, it truly is. But like most masterpieces, it comes with strings attached. Every part of the F-35, from its maintenance to its software, operates under strict U.S. oversight. Its advanced systems can't function without specialized hangars, classified infrastructure, and a constant connection to American-controlled networks. Every update, every diagnostic, every mission configuration must first pass through Washington's approval chain. For Canada, that means even the skies it patrols aren't entirely its own. The F-35 gives nations incredible capability, but at a price: dependence. In sharp contrast stands the Gripen, a jet that belongs entirely to its operator. It doesn't need sprawling bases or armies of technicians. It can land on a highway, refuel, rearm, and take off again, all within 10 minutes, using little more than a few trained personnel and a tanker truck. Its design reflects a deeply Swedish belief: true defense should never depend on permission. As stories of the Gripen's performance spread through defense circles, something began to shift. Countries with limited budgets but serious security needs started to take notice. They saw in it something rare: modern capability without strings attached. It wasn't just a fighter jet anymore. It had become a symbol of sovereignty, a reminder that power doesn't have to mean dependence. For these nations, the Gripen represented a quiet revolution. It proved that strength isn't measured by how much money you spend, but by how much control you keep. In an age dominated by defense contracts worth billions, Sweden had offered something far more valuable: freedom. Meanwhile, in Canada, the conversation began to change. Public opinion, once firmly behind the F-35, started to waver. Commentators, analysts, and former pilots began to raise the same uncomfortable point. Was Canada's cutting-edge fighter actually its own? Every repair, every data link, every update would tie Canada's operations directly to Washington. The same autonomy that once defined the Royal Canadian Air Force, the same spirit that built its global reputation, now risked being diluted. The F-35 offered advanced technology, yes, but it also demanded trust without control. And so the contrast became impossible to ignore. Sweden's Gripen, affordable, adaptable, and independent, versus America's F-35, powerful, precise, but deeply tethered. In the end, the difference wasn't just about jets, it was about philosophy. For Sweden, every line of the Gripen's design carries a message. Real strength doesn't come from overwhelming force. It comes from control, self-reliance, and the courage to think differently.
The rise of the Gripen sent a quiet but powerful message across the world, a message that challenged decades of assumptions about who gets to define power. Here was a jet born not in a military superpowers factory, but in a small Scandinavian nation with clarity, focus, and a refusal to compromise. It proved that intelligence and independence could rival even the most expensive systems money could buy. That innovation with purpose could level the global playing field. Sweden had built not just a fighter jet, it had built a philosophy, a belief that true strength lies in self-reliance, not dependence. Canada's story, however, reflected the other side of that same coin. Its choice of the F-35 represented alignment with allies, with NATO standards, and with American technology. It was a choice for partnership and political certainty, but it came with a cost: autonomy. To some, the F-35 remains a symbol of shared defense and high-tech unity. To others, it's a billion-dollar mistake, a decision that traded independence for convenience and control for compliance. But beneath the politics and the procurement paperwork, a deeper question has begun to echo through Canada's defense circles. What defines national strength? Is it reliance on the world's most powerful ally, or the courage to stand apart and carve your own path? Sweden answered that question long ago. The Gripen became its declaration of self-belief, a machine crafted by a nation that trusted its own mind when the world doubted it. And in doing so, Sweden didn't just build a fighter, it redefined the meaning of power itself. What followed was nothing short of a storm. What started as whispers in military briefings soon turned into a global conversation shaking the aviation world. The lightweight Gripen began to outperform expectations, outmaneuvering competitors, dominating NATO evaluations, and winning respect in training exercises across Europe. Suddenly, the jet once dismissed as modest was being hailed as a masterpiece of modern engineering. And in Ottawa, the silence began to break. Behind closed doors, frustration surfaced in Parliament. Headlines began to question the F-35 commitment. public voices, once quiet, started to rise. Had Canada turned its back on the very aircraft designed for its own skies? Across defense think tanks, news studios, and online forums, the tone began to shift. Even longtime supporters of the F-35 started to rethink their stance. Because the truth was impossible to ignore. The Gripen wasn't just a good fighter jet. It was a perfect match for Canada's unique geography and climate. Where the F-35 demanded sprawling air bases and expensive hangars, the Gripen could operate from frozen highways in the Arctic. Where the F-35 required vast support teams and complex logistics, the Gripen needed only a handful of technicians to refuel and relaunch. It was fast, simple, and built for resilience. As new videos emerged, the Gripen slicing through snow-covered mountains, landing effortlessly on narrow, icy roads, disbelief spread across Canada. Citizens began asking the same haunting question. Had we chosen the wrong jet? The aircraft once dismissed as an underdog now looked like the fighter made for Canada itself. And as that realization spread, so did a powerful shift in public opinion. A quiet awakening that perhaps, in chasing technology, Canada had turned away from something far greater: freedom of control.
If Sweden, a country smaller in size, budget, and military power, could create a fighter so capable, then why had Canada tied itself so tightly to an aircraft that required constant dependence on another nation? Why did a small Nordic country seem to understand Canada's defense needs better than Canada itself? While those questions stirred uneasily in Ottawa, Saab, the Swedish company behind the Gripen, was quietly rewriting its own success story. Brazil expanded its fleet. Hungary renewed its long-term contracts. Thailand entered new negotiations. And across Europe, military planners began whispering the same thing. Maybe Sweden had discovered the smarter path, not the most expensive, but the most sustainable. The Gripen was no longer seen as a budget fighter. It had become a symbol of strategic independence, a jet that represented freedom, flexibility, and control. Inside Canada's defense circles, that shift didn't go unnoticed. Analysts, pilots, and policymakers began to acknowledge something uncomfortable. The Gripen didn't just compete, it embodied the very philosophy Canada once stood for: sovereignty and self-reliance. Yes, the F-35 deal had been signed. The contract was sealed, the payment scheduled. But in the deeper debate, one about identity and direction, the Swedish fighter was winning hearts and minds. Then came the headline that captured the nation's mood like no official statement ever could. A major Canadian newspaper printed in bold letters, "Sweden offers the freedom we paid to lose." The phrase went viral. It echoed through Parliament, defense panels, and social media feeds. Because it struck a nerve, it wasn't about pride or politics anymore. It was about who Canada wanted to be. Once, Canada had been a global aerospace pioneer, building the legendary Avro Arrow, a symbol of national ingenuity and ambition. Now, decades later, it found itself purchasing not just an aircraft, but a dependency. The Gripen, by contrast, stood for the very thing Canada used to champion: the belief that a nation should own its skies and make its own decisions. And so the conversation began to change. No longer just about combat performance or cost per flight hour, but about something far more profound: control. Who truly commands Canada's defense capabilities? Who approves its missions, updates its software, or manages its systems? Could a nation still call itself sovereign in the air if every repair, every patch, every update required someone else's permission? The answers were not easy to face. The F-35 program had indeed delivered cutting-edge technology, but it had also quietly eroded something priceless: the ability to act independently. As the roar of its afterburners faded into the cold northern sky, one truth lingered, haunting yet clear. Canada hadn't lost because of inferior technology. It hadn't lost because of lack of ambition. It lost because it forgot what made it strong in the first place. Independence cannot be purchased. It must be preserved, protected, and trusted. So, what do you think? Was Canada's choice a necessary alliance or a costly surrender of autonomy? Let us know your thoughts below. And don't forget to subscribe for more deep defense insights.